In the final months of World War II, a strange and sobering phenomenon swept across Western Europe. German soldiers began surrendering to American and British forces, not in scattered pockets, but in massive coordinated waves. Between March and May 1945, nearly 3 million German troops laid down their arms to the Western Allies. In April alone, over 1.5 million surrendered, tens of thousands every single day. They were not out of ammunition. Their defenses were not entirely overrun. And Hitler was still alive. They surrendered for one overwhelming reason: to avoid falling into Soviet hands. On the Eastern Front, the German army had come to know the Red Army not just as a military opponent, but as an avenging force. Stories from the East were whispered through the ranks of mass executions, starvation, death marches, and labor camps deep in Siberia. German soldiers knew what awaited them if they were captured by the Soviets. Of the 91,000 men who surrendered at Stalingrad in 1943, only around 6,000 ever returned home. The rest died in Soviet captivity, starved, frozen, worked to death. For many Germans in 1945, Soviet captivity wasn't a possibility. It was a death sentence. This fear was not only personal, but collective. German troops knew what they had done on the Eastern Front. They had participated in a war of extermination, targeting Soviet civilians, partisans, and prisoners of war. Millions had died at the hands of the Wehrmacht and SS. Entire villages were wiped out. Soviet citizens had suffered unimaginable horrors. So when the Red Army pushed westward, they came not only as liberators, but as executioners of justice. The Germans feared that justice would be merciless. By contrast, the Americans and British represented something else entirely. German troops who surrendered in the West were treated according to the Geneva Conventions. They received food, medical care, and humane treatment. Even in hastily built camps like the Rhine Meadows, where conditions were difficult but temporary, less than 1% of German prisoners held by the Americans died in captivity. The contrast with the Soviet death rate, over 35%, couldn't have been clearer. For German soldiers, it became a simple equation. West meant life, East meant death. The difference was visible. German troops could often see their comrades being held in open-air American camps, receiving food and water. These images contradicted Nazi propaganda and confirmed what soldiers had begun to suspect. Surrendering to the West was survivable. That's why, in the spring of 1945, entire divisions marched through their own lines just to reach American forces. They surrendered not in defeat, but in desperation, seeking out their enemies to save themselves from their allies. One of the most striking examples was the Ruhr Pocket. In April 1945, over 300,000 German troops were surrounded by the Americans. Their commander, Field Marshal Walter Model, refused to surrender and instead took his own life. But his troops made a different choice. Over the following days, they surrendered en masse. The Americans took hundreds of thousands of prisoners with minimal fighting. They had every reason to fight on ammunition, fortified positions, experienced troops. But they knew that if they did, the Soviets might eventually catch up. On the Eastern Front, the story was tragically different. In the Battle of Halbe, as the Soviets closed in on Berlin, around 200,000 German troops and tens of thousands of civilians were encircled. Their commander ordered a desperate breakout to reach the Americans. Soviet forces fought viciously to contain them. Tens of thousands were killed. Only a fraction made it through. For them, the difference between life and death was measured in kilometers, and many never reached safety. This difference shaped the end of the war. Where surrender to the West was possible, German resistance collapsed rapidly. But where only the Soviets were present, the Germans fought to the bitter end. Berlin itself was defended block by block in a suicidal last stand. German commanders knew the war was over. They weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting to avoid Soviet captivity. That's why, even after Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7 and 8, skirmishes continued in places like Czechoslovakia and the Baltics. German troops were still trying to reach American lines. After the war, the consequences of these choices became even clearer. Most German prisoners held by the Americans returned home by 1948. They helped rebuild West Germany, supported its new democracy, and became part of the post-war recovery. Their experience of American captivity shaped how they viewed the West and how West Germany will align in the decades to come. In contrast, German POWs held by the Soviets remained in labor camps for years. Some were not released until 1956, more than a decade after the war ended. Many never returned at all. The mass surrenders in the West weren't just about surviving the war. They shaped the post-war world. They helped populate the new Federal Republic of Germany with men who had experienced American pragmatism rather than Soviet retribution. They laid the human foundation for Germany's integration into NATO and its partnership with the United States. Ironically, the very soldiers who once fought for a fascist regime became some of the earliest participants in building Western democracy in Germany. The question of justice remains difficult. Most of these soldiers were never held accountable for their roles in Nazi crimes, especially those committed in the East. Trials focus on top leaders, the SS, and death camp personnel. The ordinary Wehrmacht soldier, many of whom had participated in atrocities, was often able to quietly reintegrate into society. The Allies made a pragmatic choice: stability over retribution. And in the West, it worked. Ultimately, the story of why so many German soldiers surrendered to the West is a story of fear, guilt, survival, and rational calculation. Faced with two paths, one toward vengeance, the other toward mercy, millions of men chose to live. Their decision helped end the war faster, with fewer casualties on the Western Front, and it helped shape the world that emerged after the guns fell silent. In the brutal calculus of war, they made a clear choice: